Maya's white cane swept across polished marble until it struck something immovable, the vampire king's legs. The throne room fell silent. What no one knew, the ancient ruler could scent the impossible, his own bloodline stirring within her womb, a child that should not exist. The polished marble beneath Maya Rodriguez's feet felt endless as she navigated the grand corridors of Castle Drackle, her white cane tapping a steady rhythm that echoed off vaulted ceilings she could only imagine. Echo, her golden retriever guide dog, had refused to enter the main hall 20 minutes ago, whimpering and backing away from invisible threats that made Maya's skin prickle with unease. She should have trusted him, but the Human Supernatural Integration Summit was too important to miss, and her advocacy group had fought for months to secure her invitation as their disability rights representative. The massive stone fortress overwhelmed her other senses with its competing scents of ancient wood, burning candles, and something metallic that made her stomach clench with inexplicable recognition. Maya counted her steps as she'd been taught, mapping the space in her mind as voices drifted from the throne room ahead, speaking in languages that sounded like velvet and shadows. Her cane swept left then right across the marble until it struck something immovable, solid as granite, but warm like living flesh. The impact sent vibrations up her arm, and she stumbled forward, her palms pressing against expensive fabric that felt like midnight itself. Silence crashed over the massive chamber like a physical weight, hundreds of conversations dying mid-syllable, as if someone had stolen the air from every lung simultaneously. Maya's enhanced hearing caught the sharp intake of breath from dozens of throats, the rustle of silk and leather as bodies turned toward them, the almost inaudible whisper of steel sliding against scabbards somewhere in the darkness beyond her perception. Above her, she felt rather than heard the presence of someone tall and utterly still, radiating a coldness that made her fingertips numb despite the warmth of his skin beneath the fabric. King Lucian Drackle, 8 centuries of existence compressed into a moment of absolute recognition, felt his supernatural senses explode with impossible knowledge as her scent reached him. Beneath the human fragrance of vanilla and rain, beneath the nervousness that clung to her like morning mist, lay something that stopped his dead heart completely. His own essence, his blood, his very soul somehow growing within this fragile human woman's womb, a child that defied every law of supernatural biology he'd learned across 800 years of existence. The assembled supernatural dignitaries watched their emotionally distant king stand paralyzed, his usual mask of controlled indifference cracking as he stared down at the blind woman who had just shattered his understanding of what was possible. Maya felt heat flood her cheeks, as she realized she'd walked directly into someone important, someone whose presence commanded the massive chamber with the weight of absolute authority. Her words tumbled out in a rush of mortification, apologies spilling from her lips as she tried to step back and restore proper distance between them. But when his hands closed gently around her arms to steady her, the world exploded into impossible sensation. Light burst behind her sightless eyes. Not the familiar darkness she'd known for 26 years, but actual illumination that showed her a face carved from marble and shadow, eyes like winter storms, and something ancient and wounded looking back at her with recognition she couldn't understand. Lucian felt his dormant humanity crack open like ice in spring sun, as her touch sent electricity through every nerve he'd thought long dead, awakening emotions he'd buried beneath centuries of necessary coldness. Maya gasped and pulled back from the contact, her heart hammering against her ribs as phantom images danced through her mind, visions of blood and moonlight and someone calling her name in a voice like distant thunder. She stammered another apology, gathering her cane with trembling fingers while trying to process what had just happened to her. Why touching this stranger had filled her blind world with impossible light and half-remembered dreams that felt more real than her waking life. Captain Mira Blackwood materialized beside them with predatory grace, her hand resting casually on her sword hilt as she assessed the situation with the cold efficiency of someone who'd spent decades protecting vampire royalty from threats both obvious and subtle. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience as she moved to escort Maya away from what she perceived as a security breach, her dark eyes scanning the assembled crowd for signs of orchestrated attack or political maneuvering. But Lucian's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, quiet, but carrying absolute command as he spoke two words that sent ripples of speculation through every supernatural faction present. She stays. The phrase hung in the air like a pronouncement from on high, causing werewolf alphas to exchange meaningful glances, witch covens to whisper among themselves, and vampire nobles to study their king with newfound interest as they tried to decode why he'd chosen to protect a random human woman. Maya heard the shift in the room's energy, felt the weight of hundreds of supernatural gazes settling on her like a physical presence as conversations resumed in hushed tones that spoke of political implications and shifting power dynamics she couldn't begin to understand. Lucian stepped back and smoothed his expression into the diplomatic mask he'd perfected over centuries of ruling, his voice taking on the careful neutrality of a court official as he identified himself as Luke, a cultural liaison assigned to help summit attendees navigate the complex protocols of supernatural diplomacy. Maya accepted the explanation with grateful relief, unaware that the most powerful vampire in the Eastern European Covenant had just appointed himself as her personal guide and protector while he investigated the impossible mystery of how she carried his child. Over the following hours, as Luke led her through the labyrinthine castle and introduced her to various supernatural representatives, Maya found herself sharing pieces of her life story with surprising ease. She told him about growing up with her grandmother Rosa after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8, how Rosa had taught her that blindness was simply a different way of experiencing the world rather than a limitation to be pitied or overcome. She spoke about her work as a social worker in Detroit, advocating for people society preferred to ignore, fighting for accessibility and dignity for those the world deemed inconvenient or invisible. As she talked, she noticed how Luke listened with an intensity that seemed to go beyond polite interest, how his questions drew out details she rarely shared with strangers, how his presence made her feel simultaneously safe and electrically aware in ways that confused and thrilled her. What she didn't mention were the strange dreams that had been plaguing her for weeks, visions of rain-soaked streets and the scent of copper and roses, or the fainting spells that left her disoriented and grasping for memories that slipped away like smoke. Lucian absorbed every word while wrestling with emotions he'd suppressed for centuries. The protective fury that rose when she mentioned discrimination she'd faced, the warmth that spread through his chest when she laughed, the desperate need to understand how this remarkable woman had become connected to him in ways that transcended everything he thought he knew about vampire biology. His inner council watched from the shadows with growing suspicion, as their usually detached king showed unprecedented interest in a human. Their whispered conversations, speculating about weakness and political vulnerability that enemies might exploit. Elder Magnus Thornfield's pale eyes tracked their every movement, while Countess Serafina Voltaire's nostrils flared with barely contained curiosity as she tried to identify what made this particular human so fascinating to their sovereign. The formal dinner that evening took place in the castle's great hall, a cavernous space lit by thousands of candles that cast dancing shadows across stone walls hung with tapestries depicting supernatural history in threads of gold and blood. Maya sat beside Luke at a table positioned to give her optimal acoustic access to the various speeches and presentations, her enhanced hearing picking up conversations in dozens of languages as representatives from every supernatural faction attempted to navigate the delicate politics of species integration. The wine was ancient and complex, carrying flavors that seemed to tell stories of vineyards that had existed for millennia, and Maya found herself relaxing despite the underlying tension she could sense in the room, like a low electrical hum. Halfway through the evening, as the vampire king of France was delivering remarks about territorial boundaries and feeding protocols, Maya felt the familiar warning signs that preceded her recent episodes. The world began to tilt and blur around the edges, her enhanced hearing becoming suddenly muffled as if she were underwater, her skin growing hot and cold simultaneously as her body fought against some invisible force. She gripped the edge of the table and tried to breathe through the sensation, but this time was different, stronger, more insistent as images began flooding her mind with crystalline clarity. Rain pounded against broken asphalt as she ran through empty streets, her enhanced hearing tracking footsteps behind her that moved with inhuman speed and grace. Terror filled her throat like bile as something with glowing eyes and razor teeth caught up to her in an alley that smelled of garbage and desperation, its claws raking across her throat as she fell to her knees in a spreading pool of blood. Then another presence arrived like lightning given form, ancient and terrible and utterly furious as it tore her attacker apart with bare hands that moved like striking serpents. She felt herself lifted in arms that trembled with barely controlled rage, heard a voice like distant thunder speaking words in a language that predated human civilization, felt warm liquid trickling down her throat as someone pressed his wrist to her lips and commanded her to drink. The vision shattered like glass as Maya gasped and found herself back in the great hall with Luke's concerned face inches from hers, his cold hands steady on her shoulders as he searched her eyes for signs of distress or injury. Around them, conversations had paused as other attendees noticed her distress, their supernatural senses picking up the spike of adrenaline and confusion that rolled off her in waves. Maya tried to speak but found her throat raw, as if she'd been screaming, her heart hammering against her ribs as the metallic taste of copper filled her mouth, despite the fact that she'd been drinking wine moments before. Lucian recognized the signs immediately, having witnessed blood memories awakening in newly turned vampires for centuries, but seeing it happen to Maya filled him with terror rather than the clinical interest he'd felt observing other supernatural transformations. She was remembering their encounter 6 months ago, the night he'd saved her life by performing ancient blood magic that created an unbreakable soul bond between them, the night he'd unknowingly planted the seed of their impossible child in her womb. He helped her to her feet and guided her from the hall with gentle efficiency, murmuring explanations about altitude and exhaustion to concerned inquiries, while his mind raced with the implications of her awakening memories. Once they reached the privacy of a small chamber overlooking the castle gardens, Maya finally found her voice to ask the question that had been burning in her chest since the vision ended. She wanted to know if they'd met before tonight, if her dreams of blood and rain and someone saving her life were more than just her imagination running wild in response to supernatural overload. Lucian stood silhouetted against the window, moonlight turning his hair to silver as he wrestled with the decision that would change both their lives forever, whether to tell her the truth about their connection or maintain the protective lie that kept her safely ignorant of the supernatural world's dangers. Before he could respond, a new scent drifted through the chamber, like expensive perfume laced with warning, and Countess Serafina Voltaire glided through the doorway with the grace of a predator who'd finally identified her prey. Her ancient eyes fixed on Maya, with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle that had been frustrating her for hours, her enhanced senses confirming what she'd suspected since the moment Maya had collided with their king in the throne room. The scent of Lucian's blood ran through this human woman's veins like a river of liquid starlight, marking her as something that should not exist, according to every supernatural law Serafina had learned across her 6 centuries of existence. But more than that, she could detect the impossible fragrance of new life growing within Maya's womb. A child that carried the vampire king's essence, despite the biological impossibility of such conception between their species. Serafina's smile held all the warmth of winter frost, as she realized she'd just discovered the perfect weapon to destroy the progressive policies Lucian had been championing. The integration efforts that threatened the traditional vampire hierarchy she'd spent centuries protecting and advancing. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The confrontation between Seraphina and Lucian took place in the castle's ancient war room, where stone walls had witnessed 8 centuries of vampire political maneuvering and bloodshed, the Countess gliding through the doorway like silk wrapped around a blade, as her enhanced senses confirmed what she had suspected since Maya's collision with the throne room floor. Seraphina's voice carried the dangerous sweetness of poisoned honey as she addressed Lucian with the familiarity of someone who had known him for centuries. Her pale fingers tracing patterns in the dust of maps that showed territories conquered and lost across the ages, while she spoke of the impossible scent that clung to the human woman like morning mist. She explained with clinical precision how Maya's blood sang with Lucian's essence, how the life growing within her womb defied every biological law their kind had understood since the dawn of vampiric existence, how the Vampire Council would react with swift and merciless judgment if they learned their king had somehow created an abomination that threatened the purity of their bloodlines. Lucian's response came like winter lightning, his voice dropping to the register that had once commanded armies and brought kingdoms to their knees. But Seraphina merely smiled with the confidence of someone who held cards he could not see, as she reminded him of the political realities that governed even kings. The council's ancient laws were clear and non-negotiable when it came to hybrid offspring. Any vampire who created such a creature faced execution alongside their forbidden child. And while Lucian might rule the Eastern European covenant with an iron fist, he was still bound by the sacred traditions that predated his own existence by millennia. Seraphina's ultimatum hung in the air between them like a sword suspended by spider silk, as she offered her silence in exchange for concessions that would strengthen the traditionalist faction's position within the supernatural hierarchy, her ancient eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she watched him wrestle with the impossible choice between protecting Maya and maintaining the political stability that kept their entire species from descending into civil war. Meanwhile, Maya found herself experiencing changes that defied every assumption she had made about her own limitations and capabilities, her enhanced hearing becoming so acute that she could distinguish individual heartbeats from 3 floors away, her sense of smell developing to the point where she could track people's emotions through the subtle chemical changes in their scent signatures. Echo's behavior had become increasingly protective and agitated since their arrival at the castle, the golden retriever refusing to leave her side even for basic needs, his body trembling with tension whenever other summit attendees approached too closely, his sensitive canine instincts detecting the supernatural changes occurring within his beloved human with the clarity that only animals possessed. Dr. Elena Vasquez noticed Maya's symptoms during a routine health check she had requested after the previous evening's episode. The summit's human medical coordinator, observing with growing concern how Maya's reflexes had sharpened beyond normal human parameters, how her pupils dilated in response to stimuli that shouldn't affect someone with her type of blindness, how her pulse rate remained elevated in ways that suggested her cardiovascular system was adapting to demands far beyond typical human requirements. Elena's medical training had been supplemented by years of working with supernatural communities, her understanding of mystical biology making her uniquely qualified to recognize signs that other human doctors would dismiss as stress or imagination, and she found herself documenting symptoms that pointed toward possibilities she had only read about in ancient texts and forbidden research journals. Lucian arranged private sessions with Maya under the pretense of cultural education, leading her through the castle's maze of corridors and chambers while teaching her to navigate by touch and sound in ways that went far beyond standard mobility training for the visually impaired. His hands guided hers across stone walls carved with supernatural history, showing her how to read the vibrations that different materials created when touched, how to interpret the acoustic properties of spaces that had been designed to amplify or muffle sound according to their intended purposes. Maya found herself drawn to the low rumble of his voice as it resonated through her enhanced hearing. The familiar scent that she now recognized from her blood memories, becoming stronger and more intoxicating with each passing hour they spent together. The gentle strength in his hands, awakening responses in her body that had nothing to do with supernatural transformation, and everything to do with the growing attraction that neither of them could deny or ignore. Their intimacy deepened through these shared explorations as Lucian revealed the castle's secrets while carefully avoiding the most dangerous truths about his own nature. His protective instincts warring with his desire to prepare her for the supernatural world she was already becoming part of, whether she understood it or not. The Vampire Council convened an emergency session within the castle's deepest chambers, a circular room carved from living rock, where Elder Magnus Thornfield presided over discussions that would determine the fate of supernatural communities across 3 continents. Reports had reached them through various channels about unusual activities surrounding the human woman, who had somehow captured their king's unprecedented attention, whispered accounts of enhanced abilities that suggested supernatural interference, territorial disputes arising from Lucian's obvious protection of someone who should mean nothing to vampire politics. Magnus addressed the assembled council members with the gravity of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, his ancient voice carrying the weight of authority as he demanded explanations for behavior that threatened to destabilize carefully maintained power structures. The council operated under laws that had been written in blood and bound by oath across millennia of vampire existence, their most sacred prohibition involving the creation of hybrid offspring that could contaminate the purity of their supernatural bloodlines, any violation punishable by immediate execution of all parties involved, including the abomination itself. Lucian deflected their inquiries with the skill of someone who had survived 8 centuries of political intrigue, offering plausible explanations for his interest in human supernatural integration, while carefully avoiding any mention of the impossible pregnancy that grew stronger within Maya's womb with each passing hour. But he could feel time running out like sand through his fingers as the council's suspicions sharpened, their collective attention focusing on Maya with the intensity of predators who had caught the scent of something that didn't belong in their carefully ordered world. Maya sought out Dr. Vasquez after another episode left her shaking and disoriented in her guest chambers. The medical coordinator's calm professionalism providing an anchor of familiar humanity in the increasingly surreal landscape of supernatural politics and awakening abilities that she couldn't understand or control. Elena listened with growing alarm as Maya described symptoms that went far beyond anything she had experienced before, the fainting spells accompanied by visions that felt more real than her waking memories, physical changes that seemed to be accelerating rather than stabilizing, emotional responses to people and situations that defied her normally excellent judgment about human character and motivation. The medical tests Elena conducted in the privacy of her makeshift clinic revealed results that should have been impossible according to everything she knew about human biology, blood work showing hormone levels consistent with pregnancy, despite Maya's absolute certainty that she had not been intimate with anyone in over a year. Neurological responses suggesting enhanced sensory processing that typically took months or years to develop in people adjusting to blindness. Elena's supernatural knowledge, gained through years of studying mystical biology and working with creatures whose existence challenged conventional medical understanding, led her to conclusions that terrified and fascinated her in equal measure as she realized Maya's pregnancy was not just unusual, but fundamentally impossible, according to natural law. The truth Lucian finally revealed came wrapped in careful explanations designed to protect Maya from the full horror of her situation while preparing her for realities that would reshape everything she thought she knew about the world and her place within it. His confession about his true nature as vampire royalty rather than a diplomatic aide sent shockwaves through her enhanced perception, as pieces of her recent experiences suddenly aligned into patterns that made terrifying sense, His explanations about supernatural pregnancy and the political dangers she faced, creating a new understanding of why her life had become so complicated and confusing in ways she could never have anticipated. Maya felt betrayed by the lies he had told her, while simultaneously recognizing the protection those lies had provided. Her anger at his deception warring with her growing awareness that he had been trying to keep her safe from knowledge that could destroy her sanity or her life. Her blindness, which had defined her identity for 26 years, became suddenly irrelevant as supernatural senses awakened within her consciousness, allowing her to perceive Lucian with a clarity that transcended physical sight and revealed the ancient pain and desperate love that drove his every protective instinct. She could sense the terrible burden he carried, the weight of responsibilities that spanned centuries and continents, the impossible choice between his duty to his people and his growing devotion to her that threatened to tear him apart from within. Lucian's offer of choice came with the brutal honesty of someone who had learned that love sometimes required the courage to let go. His explanation of memory modification procedures that could return her to her normal life, accompanied by the unspoken acknowledgement that saving her mind might mean sacrificing their child and any possibility of the future he had begun to envision with her. Maya's decision to stay emerged from depths of her soul that she had never explored before, driven not by fear of the unknown or obligation to the life growing within her womb that she barely understood, but by the recognition that she was falling in love with this impossible man whose ancient heart had somehow learned to beat again because of her presence in his carefully controlled world. She chose to embrace the supernatural transformation that was already changing her from within to accept his protection and guidance, as she learned to navigate realities that would challenge everything she thought she knew about strength and vulnerability, about the relationship between sight and perception, about the power that could emerge from embracing rather than fearing the unknown aspects of existence. Her choice bound them together in ways that transcended the blood magic that had initially connected their souls, creating a partnership built on trust and growing love rather than supernatural compulsion, setting the stage for confrontations that would test their commitment to each other and to the impossible future they were choosing to build together against all odds and ancient prohibitions. The training began in the castle's ancient practice chambers, where moonlight streamed through stained glass windows depicting vampire history in shades of crimson and gold. Lucian, guiding Maya through exercises designed to awaken the supernatural awareness that her vampire-touched blood had made possible. Her enhanced perception revealed the world in ways that transcended physical sight, as energy signatures blazed around every living creature, like aurora made manifest, emotions painting the air in colors that had no names in human language. Truth and deception creating distinct harmonic frequencies that resonated through her consciousness with crystalline clarity. Maya discovered she could sense the ancient power that flowed through Lucian's immortal form like liquid. Starlight could perceive the careful control he maintained over instincts that had been honed by 8 centuries of survival and conquest, could feel the growing warmth in his undead heart that her presence had somehow rekindled after lifetimes of frozen solitude. Their training sessions became intimate dances of trust and growing desire, as he taught her to move with supernatural grace, to anticipate attacks through reading energy patterns rather than relying on sound and touch alone, to fight using abilities that made her blindness not just irrelevant, but actually advantageous, since her perception cut through illusions and deceptions that might fool ordinary sight. Lucian rediscovered emotions he had buried beneath layers of necessary cruelty and political calculation, the protective fury that rose whenever Maya faced even imagined threats, the tenderness that surprised him when she struggled with concepts that challenged everything she thought she knew about her own limitations and capabilities. Dr. Elena Vasquez became their unlikely ally after witnessing Maya's transformation firsthand. her scientific curiosity overcoming her initial fear as she documented changes that rewrote everything medical science thought it understood about the boundaries between human and supernatural biology. Elena's research into mystical pregnancy revealed historical precedents that were both encouraging and terrifying. Ancient texts describing hybrid offspring born to supernatural fathers and human mothers who possessed unusual psychic sensitivity or had undergone blood magic rituals that prepared their bodies for the impossible fusion of mortal and immortal essence. She explained to Maya and Lucian that such pregnancies were theoretically possible but historically fatal without precise medical and mystical intervention. The human body typically unable to sustain the accelerated development and supernatural demands that hybrid children placed on their mother's physiology. Elena's knowledge became crucial as Maya's pregnancy progressed at supernatural speed, her enhanced abilities growing stronger daily, while her human form struggled to adapt to changes that should have taken months or years to develop safely. The three formed a secret alliance dedicated to protecting both Maya and her unborn child while navigating the increasingly dangerous political landscape that surrounded their forbidden relationship. Elder Magnus Thornfield's suspicions crystallized into action as reports reached him through vampire intelligence networks about unusual supernatural activity in Detroit 6 months prior. Investigations that revealed traces of blood magic performed in an alley where human blood had mixed with something far older and more powerful than mortal understanding could encompass. The vampire hunters he dispatched were ancient creatures whose loyalty to the council superseded any personal feelings about their targets, beings who had spent centuries tracking down violations of supernatural law with the relentless efficiency of apex predators, following a scent trail that led inevitably to judgment and execution. Their investigation uncovered evidence that someone of immense power had saved a human woman's life using forbidden rituals, blood magic residue that carried the distinctive signature of vampire royalty, despite the impossibility of such intervention being performed without the council's knowledge and explicit permission. Magnus realized that his king had been keeping secrets that threatened the very foundation of vampire law, actions that could destabilize their entire political structure if revealed to the supernatural community at large. Countess Serafina chose the moment of maximum political vulnerability to make her move, addressing the assembled supernatural community during what should have been a routine discussion of territorial agreements and feeding protocols. Her voice carried across the Great Hall with the practiced authority of someone who had spent centuries manipulating vampire politics, her words carefully chosen to maximize shock value while providing undeniable evidence of Lucian's violation of their most sacred laws. She revealed Maya's pregnancy with clinical precision, explaining how the impossible child threatened to contaminate vampire bloodlines that had remained pure since the dawn of their species, how their king's weakness for a human woman had led him to commit the ultimate betrayal of everything they stood for as a superior form of life. The supernatural community erupted into chaos as various factions processed the implications of her revelation, werewolf alphas exchanging meaningful glances, while witch covens whispered among themselves about prophecies that spoke of children born between worlds. Vampire nobles splitting between those who saw opportunity in their king's vulnerability and those who recognized the existential threat that hybrid offspring represented to their way of life. Serafina's demand that the council invoke ancient law rang through the chamber like a death knell, her call for immediate judgment backed by traditionalist factions who had been seeking an excuse to remove Lucian from power for decades. Maya felt the shift in the chamber's energy through her enhanced perception, supernatural auras blazing with anger and fear and predatory calculation as hundreds of immortal beings processed the revelation that would reshape their understanding of what was possible between their species. Her newfound abilities allowed her to perceive the immediate danger, not just to herself, but to the progressive policies that Lucian had been championing, the integration efforts that had brought hope to supernatural minorities who had spent centuries living in the shadows of vampire hierarchy. Drawing upon her years of advocacy experience and her enhanced understanding of supernatural politics, Maya rose from her place at the high table and addressed the assembly. Directly, her voice carrying through the chamber with supernatural resonance as she spoke about the right of her child to exist despite the circumstances of its conception. She challenged their prejudices against the different and impossible by drawing parallels to human disability rights, explaining how society's fear of variation had always led to discrimination and violence against those who didn't conform to arbitrary standards of normalcy or purity. Maya's words resonated through the supernatural community like ripples in a still pond, her enhanced perception allowing her to sense which beings responded to her message with recognition and sympathy, versus those whose ancient prejudices had calcified beyond any possibility of change or growth. Her speech revealed the strength that blindness had taught her, the ability to perceive truth beneath surface appearances, the courage that came from understanding that difference could be a source of power rather than weakness if embraced rather than feared. Lucian felt pride and terror war within his chest as he watched Maya claim her agency in a situation that could destroy them both. Her refusal to be a passive victim in supernatural politics that had operated according to ancient patterns of dominance and submission for millennia. The acknowledgement Lucian was forced to make came like blood drawn from stone, his public admission of paternity sending shockwaves through the vampire hierarchy as the full implications of his actions became clear to every supernatural faction present in the Great Hall. His words carried the weight of absolute truth as he claimed responsibility for both Maya and their unborn child, accepting whatever judgment the ancient laws demanded while making it clear that he would fight to protect them with every resource at his disposal. The Vampire Council's response followed centuries of established protocol, as Elder Magnus invoked the right of trial by combat, the ultimate test of worthiness that would determine whether Lucian retained his crown or faced execution alongside his forbidden family. Any vampire could challenge the king's right to create a hybrid heir, the combat serving both as punishment for his crimes and opportunity for ambitious nobles to claim power for themselves through strength of arms rather than political maneuvering. Seraphina's championship of herself as challenger surprised no one who understood vampire politics, her centuries of combat experience and traditionalist backing making her a formidable opponent whose victory would restore the old ways while eliminating the progressive threat that Maya and her child represented to their established order. The trial was set for the next full moon, 3 days that would determine not just their personal fate, but the future direction of supernatural society as various factions prepared for the possibility of regime change. Lucian faced an impossible choice as he contemplated the coming combat, knowing that victory would require him to embrace the ruthless brutality that had originally made him king, to become once again the merciless ruler who had conquered territories through fear and violence rather than the man that Maya's love had helped him become. He understood that winning might save their lives but cost him his soul, transforming him back into the emotionless predator who had ruled through terror for centuries before Maya taught him that strength could coexist with compassion. The alternative was equally devastating, as losing would doom both Maya and their child to execution, while potentially throwing the supernatural world into chaos, as various factions struggled for dominance in the power vacuum his death would create. Maya's refusal to accept the role of passive victim emerged from depths of determination that surprised even her enhanced perception could reveal. Her decision to invoke ancient law that allowed the mother of a disputed heir to undergo the seeing, representing a courage that transcended anything she had ever shown in her human advocacy work. The seeing was a supernatural trial that would force her consciousness to merge with her unborn child's developing awareness, revealing the true nature and destiny of the hybrid offspring while risking both their lives in the process. Maya's choice to participate in her own fate, rather than allowing others to decide her future, reflected the same strength that had carried her through a lifetime of advocating for those society preferred to ignore. The understanding that sometimes the only way to change unjust systems was to challenge them directly, regardless of the personal cost involved. Her decision bound her fate to her child's in ways that went beyond biological connection, creating a mystical link that would either prove their worthiness to exist or destroy them both in the attempt to reveal truths that the supernatural world was not yet ready to accept or understand. The Oracle of Shadows emerged from the castle's deepest chambers, like darkness given form, her ancient presence predating vampire civilization by millennia, as she glided toward the ritual space that had been prepared in the castle's heart, where ley lines converged beneath foundations laid when the world was young. Maya felt the oracle's approach through her enhanced perception as a void in reality itself, a being so old and powerful that normal supernatural senses recoiled from direct contact with her essence, yet her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had guided countless souls through transformations that redefined the boundaries between life and death. The seeing required Maya to enter a trance state that would merge her consciousness with her unborn child's developing awareness, a psychic trial that risked destroying both their minds if the hybrid offspring proved too alien for human understanding, or if Maya's own sanity cracked under the weight of experiencing multiple realities simultaneously. The ritual chamber had been carved from living stone and inscribed with symbols that hurt to perceive directly, ancient words of power that created a space between worlds where truth could manifest without the constraints that normally governed supernatural law. Maya lay upon an altar that pulsed with its own inner light, while the oracle began chanting in languages that predated human speech, her words weaving reality like a master craftsman, working with materials that existed beyond normal perception or understanding. The first vision crashed over Maya like a tsunami of possibility as she experienced her child's potential future as a bridge between worlds. Seeing through supernatural sight that revealed humans and vampires working together in ways that had never been attempted before. The hybrid offspring moved through both communities with equal ease, their unique perception allowing them to translate between species whose fundamental differences had created centuries of mistrust and violence, their very existence proving that cooperation was possible despite biological and cultural barriers that seemed insurmountable. Maya watched her child grow into a leader who transformed supernatural society through example rather than force, showing both humans and immortal beings that diversity strengthened rather than weakened communities, willing to embrace change instead of clinging to ancient prejudices. But the vision shifted like quicksand beneath her consciousness, as she experienced an alternative future where her child became a destroyer of the supernatural order, their hybrid nature making them too powerful for either species to control or contain. The offspring's abilities grew beyond all prediction or precedent, their perception of multiple realities driving them mad with knowledge that no single mind was meant to process, their fury at being rejected by both parent species, transforming them into an instrument of vengeance that brought devastation to vampire and human communities alike. Maya felt her child's pain and rage as they realized that existing between worlds meant belonging fully to neither, their unique gifts becoming curses that isolated them from any possibility of connection or understanding with beings who feared what they represented. The third vision revealed her child as humanity's salvation, their hybrid perception allowing them to see solutions to conflicts that had plagued both species for generations, while their supernatural abilities provided the power necessary to implement changes that purely human advocates could never accomplish. Maya watched her offspring negotiate peace treaties between vampire houses and human governments, establish integration programs that benefited both communities, and create educational systems that taught tolerance and cooperation instead of the fear and hatred that had driven centuries of violence and misunderstanding. Their unique perspective, shaped by experiencing the world through multiple types of perception like Maya's blindness had taught her to do, became the key to unlocking possibilities that neither species could have discovered alone. During the most intense phase of the ritual, Maya's consciousness merged completely with her unborn child's developing awareness, and she discovered that the baby possessed qualities that transcended the simple combination of vampire and human traits that everyone had assumed would result from their impossible conception. The child's perception operated on levels that neither species had evolved to understand, capable of seeing energy patterns that revealed truth beneath surface appearances, sensing emotions and intentions with clarity that made deception impossible, perceiving connections between seemingly unrelated events in ways that could predict future consequences of present actions. Maya realized that her own blindness had been preparation for understanding this type of enhanced perception, her lifetime of navigating the world through non-visual senses giving her unique insight into how her child would experience reality in ways that transcended the limitations that normally governed supernatural or human awareness. The baby's consciousness touched hers with curious gentleness, their developing mind already showing signs of the wisdom and compassion that would define their character if they survived long enough to reach maturity in a world that might never accept their existence. Outside the ritual chamber, Lucian maintained vigil with the desperate intensity of someone facing the possible loss of everything that had given his immortal existence meaning and purpose, his usual mask of controlled composure cracking as supernatural hearing brought him fragments of Maya's experience that revealed both the wonder and terror of what she was discovering about their child's nature and potential. Captain Mira Blackwood stood beside him in silent support, her loyalty to her king extending to protecting the woman who had somehow taught him to feel emotions he had suppressed for centuries, while Dr. Elena Vasquez monitored vital signs that fluctuated wildly as Maya's consciousness traveled through realities that challenged every assumption about what was possible for hybrid offspring. The three formed an unlikely alliance united by their commitment to protecting Maya and her unborn child, their different backgrounds and species, creating a foundation for the kind of cooperation that the hybrid offspring might one day inspire on a much larger scale if given the chance to survive and grow into their unique potential. The trial by combat began at moonrise in the castle's ancient arena, where vampire royalty had settled disputes for 1,000 years. The circular space carved from black stone and surrounded by tiers of seats filled with supernatural dignitaries who had come to witness either Lucian's vindication or his destruction. Countess Serafina Voltaire entered the arena with the fluid grace of someone who had spent centuries perfecting the art of vampire combat, her ancient sword gleaming with runes that had been forged in blood and blessed by dark magic, her confidence radiating from every movement as she faced an opponent whose political vulnerabilities she intended to exploit through superior skill and ruthless determination. The battle began with supernatural speed and violence that made Mortal Kombat seem like a child's game, both combatants moving faster than human eyes could follow, while their enhanced strength turned every blow into a potentially lethal strike that could shatter stone or sever limbs with casual ease. Serafina proved herself a formidable opponent whose centuries of experience had taught her to fight with cold calculation rather than emotion, her attacks precisely targeted at weaknesses she had observed during their long political rivalry. Her defensive techniques honed through surviving conflicts that had destroyed lesser vampires. Lucian initially held back from embracing the darker aspects of his nature that had originally made him king. His reluctance to become again the merciless ruler he had been before Maya taught him compassion, creating openings that Serafina exploited with surgical precision. But as the Countess gained the upper hand and began directing threats toward Maya, even while engaged in combat, Lucian's protective fury finally unleashed the full power that had enabled him to conquer territories and command respect through 8 centuries of vampire politics. The transformation was terrifying to witness, as 800 years of suppressed violence erupted from his carefully controlled facade, his movements becoming predatory poetry that combined supernatural speed with tactical brilliance earned through countless battles against opponents who had underestimated the depth of his commitment to protecting what belonged to him. The combat became a supernatural spectacle that held the entire assembly in breathless silence, ancient weapons clashing with sounds like thunder, while both combatants drew upon power that could reshape the very stones beneath their feet. Their battle serving as a microcosm of the larger struggle between tradition and progress that would determine the future direction of supernatural society. Maya, exhausted from the seeing but still connected to Lucian through the blood bond that linked their souls across any distance, found herself able to lend him her enhanced perception despite the physical separation imposed by the ritual chamber walls. Her unique awareness flowed through their connection like liquid starlight, allowing Lucian to anticipate Seraphina's attacks through supernatural senses that revealed the Countess's intentions before her conscious mind had fully formed them, giving him the edge necessary to counter techniques that should have been impossible to defend against. Their mystical partnership demonstrated the potential that hybrid consciousness could bring to supernatural combat, the fusion of different types of perception creating capabilities that neither species possessed alone, foreshadowing the advantages their child might offer to communities willing to embrace cooperation instead of maintaining artificial divisions based on fear and prejudice. The oracle's emergence from the ritual chamber brought an end to the combat, as her ancient authority commanded respect from both fighters. Her presence radiating power that predated their conflict by millennia and put their personal dispute into perspective against the vastness of supernatural history and the potential futures that hung in the balance. Maya walked beside the oracle on unsteady legs, her consciousness still reeling from the visions she had experienced, but her enhanced perception blazing with newfound understanding of what their child represented and what would be required to ensure its survival in a world unprepared for the changes it would bring. The prophecy the oracle delivered resonated through the arena, with the weight of absolute truth, as she revealed what the seeing had shown about the hybrid offspring's nature and potential destiny. Her words painting a picture of possibilities that challenged every assumption the assembled supernatural community had made about the relationship between their species and humanity. The child would be born with sight that transcended physical vision, capable of perceiving truth and emotion and supernatural energy with clarity that would make them natural mediators and leaders in ways that neither vampire nor human communities had experienced before. But their survival depended absolutely on being raised in love by both parents and protected by a supernatural community willing to unite rather than divide in the face of change that threatened comfortable traditions and established power structures. The oracle's warning carried the terrible authority of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. Her explanation that division and hatred would kill both child and mother, forcing the assembled supernatural leaders to confront a choice that would define not just their immediate response, but the direction their species would take into an uncertain future where cooperation might be the only path to survival and growth. The supernatural community's fracture became apparent in the hours following the oracle's prophecy, as various factions retreated to private chambers and ancient meeting halls to debate the implications of accepting or rejecting the hybrid child's existence, their discussions revealing philosophical divides that had been simmering beneath the surface of diplomatic courtesy for centuries. Werewolf Alpha. Isabella Crane emerged as an unexpected ally when she approached Maya and Lucian with the measured confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating supernatural politics while protecting her pack's interests against vampire encroachment and human persecution. Isabella's auburn hair caught moonlight streaming through castle windows as she explained how her own pack had struggled for acceptance within supernatural hierarchy, how the werewolf community understood what it meant to be seen as monsters by humans, while simultaneously being treated as lesser beings by vampires who considered themselves the apex of supernatural evolution. Her support carried significant weight because werewolf loyalty was absolute once given. their pack bonds creating political alliances that could withstand pressure from other supernatural factions seeking to maintain traditional power structures. Morgana Thorne's arrival came with the scent of wild herbs and ancient magic as the Witch Coven leader glided through castle corridors like mist given form, her silver-streaked hair and deep violet eyes marking her as someone who had spent centuries studying the mystical forces that bound supernatural communities together or tore them apart. Morgana's backing proved crucial because witch covens operated outside vampire political hierarchy while maintaining enough power to influence supernatural law through their control of magical resources that even ancient vampires required for certain rituals and protections. Her endorsement of Maya and Lucian's union carried prophetic weight, since witch covens had preserved oral traditions about hybrid children that dated back to the earliest days of supernatural civilization, stories that spoke of bridge builders who would appear during times of great change to guide their communities toward evolution or destruction, depending on how they were received. Other factions remained openly hostile as traditionalist vampire houses rallied around the belief that hybrid offspring represented an existential threat to the purity that had defined their species for millennia. Their arguments supported by werewolf clans, who feared that vampire-human hybrids would upset the delicate balance of power that kept their communities from descending into open warfare. Maya found herself thrust into the role of inadvertent leader for supernatural civil rights, as her advocacy background made her a natural spokesperson for progressive change, her enhanced perception allowing her to identify potential allies among beings whose supernatural auras revealed their true feelings beneath diplomatic facades. She organized alliance-building sessions that brought together representatives from various supernatural minorities who had spent centuries operating on the margins of vampire-dominated society, creating coalitions between witch covens seeking political representation, werewolf packs demanding territorial rights, and shapeshifter communities fighting for recognition as equals rather than curiosities. Maya's unique perspective as someone who had spent her human life advocating for the invisible and forgotten translated perfectly to supernatural politics, where similar patterns of discrimination and exclusion had persisted. For generations, her ability to see beyond surface differences, allowing her to mediate conflicts between species whose mutual prejudices had prevented cooperation for thousands of years. Her enhanced perception became invaluable during these negotiations, as she could sense when participants were genuinely committed to change, versus those who attended meetings while secretly planning to undermine any agreements that challenged their traditional advantages. Lucian faced his own crisis as rebellion fractured his vampire houses, along lines that revealed how thoroughly Maya's presence had disrupted the careful political balance he had maintained for centuries through a combination of fear, respect, and calculated mercy. Half his nobles supported traditional vampire hierarchy and demanded that he choose between his crown and his forbidden family. Their arguments rooted in ancient laws that had preserved vampire purity since the species first emerged from whatever primordial darkness had given birth to their kind. The other half found themselves swayed by Maya's vision of a more inclusive supernatural world, where cooperation between species could create opportunities that none of them could achieve through isolation and mutual antagonism, their support representing a fundamental shift in vampire political philosophy that challenged everything their culture had taught them about superiority and dominance. Lucian discovered that ruling through inspiration required entirely different skills than the fear-based leadership that had served him for 8 centuries. His attempts to unite his fractured nobles, demanding emotional intelligence and persuasive ability, rather than the simple application of overwhelming force that had previously solved his political problems. The rebellion forced him to confront the reality that true leadership meant earning loyalty through shared vision rather than commanding obedience through superior strength, a lesson that Maya's love had been teaching him gradually, but which the crisis now demanded he master completely, or risk losing everything he had built across his immortal existence. Maya's supernatural pregnancy accelerated beyond all previous examples recorded in supernatural medical literature, her human physiology struggling to adapt to changes that compressed months of development into weeks, while her enhanced abilities fluctuated wildly between periods of extraordinary power and dangerous vulnerability. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked around the clock with supernatural healers who brought centuries of mystical knowledge to bear on complications that challenged both scientific understanding and magical tradition. Their collaborative efforts representing the kind of cross-species cooperation that Maya and Lucian's child would need to survive in a world still learning to accept such partnerships. The hybrid offspring's rapid development created physical strain that pushed Maya's body beyond normal human limits while her vampire-touched blood struggled to provide the supernatural energy necessary to sustain a pregnancy that drew upon both species' biological requirements simultaneously. During one particularly vulnerable episode when Maya's enhanced abilities temporarily disappeared and left her feeling truly blind for the first time since her transformation began, traditionalist vampires attempted assassination with the surgical precision of killers who had planned their strike for maximum psychological impact. The attack came during a diplomatic dinner when Maya's supernatural senses were compromised by exhaustion, her temporary vulnerability creating an opening that her enemies exploited with coordinated efficiency that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of her altered physiology. Lucian and their allies fought off the assassins with lethal grace that reminded everyone present why vampire royalty had maintained power for millennia. But the assault forced Maya to confront the reality that she could no longer remain a passive, protected figure if she hoped to survive the political storm surrounding her pregnancy. The assassination attempt became a turning point as Maya demanded that Lucian teach her advanced, supernatural combat and political strategy, her enhanced perception allowing her to master techniques in days that normally required years of training for newly turned vampires. Their relationship evolved from protector and protected to true partnership as each drew strength from the other's unique abilities and perspectives. Lucian's ancient wisdom, combining with Maya's innovative approaches to create solutions that neither could have developed alone. Maya's combat training revealed how her enhanced perception could be weaponized in ways that made traditional vampire fighting techniques obsolete. Her ability to sense intentions and energy patterns allowing her to anticipate attacks before her opponents had fully committed to them, while her supernatural speed and strength provided the physical capability to act on her prescient awareness. Elder Magnus Thornfield's call for a formal coronation ceremony represented his final attempt to resolve the crisis through traditional vampire law. His announcement that Maya must prove herself worthy to be vampire queen through supernatural trials designed to either legitimize her position or provide legal justification for removing both her and Lucian from power. The conditions Magnus set were deliberately challenging, as they required Maya to demonstrate mastery of vampire law, supernatural combat, and political wisdom in ways that would test not just her abilities, but her commitment to accepting the responsibilities that came with royal authority over one of the world's most ancient and powerful supernatural communities. Maya's acceptance of the challenge surprised even her supporters, as backing down would have provided a graceful exit from vampire politics while ensuring her child's safety through Lucian's protection, but her decision reflected her understanding that retreat would make their offspring forever vulnerable to political attacks from future traditionalist movements seeking to eliminate hybrid influences from supernatural society. The trials Magnus designed included tests of supernatural knowledge that required understanding legal precedents dating back thousands of years, combat challenges that would pit her against experienced vampire warriors whose centuries of training gave them every advantage except her unique perception-based fighting style, and political wisdom examinations that demanded she solve theoretical disputes between supernatural factions using judgment that balanced competing interests without favoring any single species. Lucian supported Maya's preparation with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that failure would mean losing everything while secretly planning to abdicate his crown if she failed the trials. His willingness to choose love over power, representing the complete transformation that her presence had worked in his immortal heart. Maya discovered his contingency plans through their blood bond and insisted they face the trials as true partners, her enhanced perception revealing his intentions despite his attempts to shield her from knowledge that might compromise her focus during the crucial tests ahead. Their conversation about shared responsibility and mutual support demonstrated how thoroughly their relationship had evolved beyond the supernatural circumstances that brought them together. Their commitment to building a life together, whether as vampire royalty or exiled lovers, proving that their bond transcended political convenience or magical compulsion. The supernatural summit transformed into an impromptu coronation ceremony as representatives from every major supernatural faction gathered to witness Maya's trials, their attendance ensuring that whatever occurred would carry political weight throughout the supernatural world and establish precedents that would influence interspecies relations for generations to come. The three trials began at dawn in the castle's Hall of Judgment, where ancient vampire law had been practiced for over a millennium. The vaulted chamber filled with representatives from every supernatural faction who had gathered to witness whether Maya Rodriguez could prove herself worthy of the crown that would make her the most powerful vampire queen in supernatural history. Elder Magnus Thornfield presided over the proceedings with the cold authority of someone who had overseen countless such trials, his ancient eyes reflecting centuries of legal precedent as he explained that Maya must demonstrate mastery in the three pillars of vampire leadership through tests designed to reveal whether her human background and hybrid pregnancy made her unfit to rule over beings whose existence predated human civilization by thousands of years. The trial of knowledge required Maya to demonstrate understanding of vampire law and supernatural politics that extended far beyond the diplomatic protocols she had learned during her weeks at the castle, Magnus presenting her with legal scenarios that had shaped supernatural society for millennia, while expecting responses that showed both scholarly comprehension and practical wisdom. Maya drew upon her enhanced perception to read the emotional undercurrents beneath each question. Recognizing that Magnus was testing not just her knowledge, but her commitment to vampire supremacy versus the progressive ideals that had made her an advocate for supernatural civil rights. Her responses consistently advocated for legal reforms that would protect supernatural minorities from discrimination within vampire-dominated hierarchy, her arguments rooted in human rights principles that she adapted to address the unique challenges faced by shapeshifters, witches, and lesser supernatural beings who had been marginalized for centuries by policies designed to maintain vampire political dominance. The assembled supernatural community watched in fascination as Maya systematically deconstructed traditional legal frameworks that had preserved vampire privilege while proposing alternative approaches that balanced species rights without destroying the stability that ancient laws had provided through periods of potential chaos and conflict. Her human rights background proved invaluable as she demonstrated how principles of equality and inclusion could strengthen rather than weaken supernatural society. Her enhanced perception allowing her to sense which audience members responded positively to her vision of reformed governance, versus those whose ancient prejudices made them resistant to any change that threatened their established advantages. The trial of power began immediately after her successful navigation of vampire legal theory. The combat arena transformed into a testing ground, where Maya would face a traditionalist challenger whose centuries of vampire fighting experience should have made victory impossible for someone who had possessed supernatural abilities for mere weeks rather than lifetimes. Baron Victor Dracos entered the arena with predatory confidence born from 800 years of combat victories, his enhanced strength and speed representing the pinnacle of vampire martial prowess, while his traditional fighting techniques had been honed through countless duels that established his reputation as one of the most dangerous warriors in Magnus's traditionalist faction. Maya's unique perception-based fighting style confused and frustrated Victor, as her enhanced awareness allowed her to anticipate his attacks before his conscious mind had fully committed to them, her ability to sense energy patterns and emotional intentions, giving her supernatural reflexes that transcended the physical limitations that should have made her easy prey for his superior experience and training. The battle became a demonstration of how different types of perception could create tactical advantages that traditional vampire combat training had never anticipated. Maya's blindness adapted awareness proving superior to conventional sight when dealing with supernatural speed that moved faster than normal vision could track effectively. Her victory over Victor sent shockwaves through the traditionalist faction while inspiring progressive supporters who recognized that her success represented the potential for evolution beyond the stagnant martial traditions that had defined vampire combat for centuries without significant innovation or improvement. The Trial of Wisdom presented Maya with a territorial dispute between the Silver Moon Werewolf Pack and House Ravencrest vampires, a conflict that had been simmering for decades without resolution because traditional vampire law favored ancient territorial claims, while werewolf pack dynamics required access to specific hunting grounds that overlapped with vampire-controlled regions. Maya's enhanced perception revealed the emotional pain beneath both sides' legal arguments, sensing the werewolves' desperate need for territory that could support their growing pack alongside the vampires' genuine fear that sharing ancient holdings would establish precedents that could destabilize their entire territorial system across multiple continents. Her solution involved creating shared territories and mixed supernatural communities where both species could coexist through carefully negotiated agreements that protected essential needs while establishing new models for interspecies cooperation that could be adapted to resolve similar conflicts throughout the supernatural world. The radical concept horrified traditionalists who viewed any compromise of vampire territorial sovereignty as unacceptable weakness, while inspiring progressives who recognized that Maya's approach offered pathways to reducing the endemic conflicts that had consumed supernatural resources and energy for generations without producing lasting solutions. Her judgment demonstrated wisdom that transcended simple legal precedent by addressing underlying causes rather than merely arbitrating surface disputes, her enhanced perception allowing her to design solutions that satisfied core needs even when surface demands seemed irreconcilably opposed. Elder Magnus revealed the final test with theatrical timing that suggested he had been planning this ultimate challenge since the trials began. His explanation that Maya must choose between saving human hostages or protecting vampire interests, designed to force her into an impossible decision that would prove her loyalty to one species at the expense of the other. The staged scenario presented her with a terrorist attack where human extremists threatened to execute supernatural prisoners unless vampire authorities surrendered strategic resources that would compromise their ability to protect their communities from future human aggression. The test requiring Maya to demonstrate whether her hybrid nature made her capable of making the harsh choices that vampire leadership demanded during crisis situations. Maya's enhanced perception immediately detected the artificial nature of the scenario, as emotional resonances from the supposed hostages revealed they were supernatural beings, using illusion magic to appear human, while the terrorist demands contained logical inconsistencies that exposed the entire situation as an elaborate manipulation designed to test her reasoning rather than an actual crisis requiring immediate resolution. Her refusal to accept the false choice surprised everyone present as she systematically exposed Magnus's deception while proposing alternative approaches that would save both human hostages and protect vampire interests through creative problem-solving that transcended the binary thinking the test was designed to enforce. Maya's solution involved negotiating directly with the actual concerns behind the staged conflict, addressing human fear of supernatural power while protecting vampire security needs through transparency and mutual cooperation rather than the adversarial relationship that traditional approaches assumed was inevitable between their species. Her demonstration of wisdom that could transcend artificial divisions foreshadowed the abilities her hybrid child would inherit, the capacity to see beyond surface conflicts to underlying commonalities that could form the foundation for lasting peace between communities that had been taught to view each other as existential threats. Lucian's formal coronation of Maya as his queen took place in the same chamber where she had completed her trials, the ancient crown that had adorned vampire royalty for over 2 millennia, settling upon her head with weight that represented not just political authority, but responsibility for guiding supernatural society through changes that would define their future for generations to come. The ceremony's symbolism resonated through every supernatural faction present, as they witnessed the first human woman ever crowned as vampire royalty. Her elevation representing either the beginning of a new era of interspecies cooperation or the corruption of ancient traditions that had preserved their communities through millennia of external threats and internal conflicts. Their victory celebration was interrupted by Captain Mira Blackwood's urgent arrival with intelligence that transformed Maya's theoretical triumph into immediate practical crisis as reports reached the castle that human military forces had surrounded their location with the apparent intent to eliminate every supernatural being present at the summit. The hostage scenario Magnus had created as a test proved to have been based on actual human military planning that his intelligence network had detected, the staged crisis becoming terrifyingly real as armored vehicles and specialized weapons, designed specifically for supernatural combat, established a perimeter that would prevent escape while preparing for an assault that could destroy centuries of carefully maintained secrecy between human and supernatural communities. The supernatural community's response divided along predictable lines, as traditionalist vampires advocated for immediate retaliation, using their superior combat abilities to eliminate the human threat before it could organize effectively, while progressive factions recognized that attacking human military forces would validate every fear that had motivated the assault while potentially triggering larger conflicts between their communities. Maya's advocacy for negotiation and peaceful demonstration, rather than violence, reflected her understanding that brute force solutions would only perpetuate the cycle of fear and mistrust that had created the crisis. Her enhanced perception revealing that the human military forces were motivated by terror rather than malice. Their aggressive posture masking genuine concern about supernatural threats to human civilians, rather than simple prejudice or hatred. Her volunteer service as ambassador to the human forces represented the ultimate test of everything she had learned about bridging differences between communities that viewed each other as existential threats, her human background providing credibility, while her supernatural abilities offered insights that could help both sides recognize their mutual fears and common interests. Lucian's initial refusal to risk her safety reflected his protective instincts as both her mate and king. But Maya's insistence that this crisis represented exactly why their child existed forced him to recognize that their hybrid offspring would face similar challenges throughout their life if the fundamental relationship between human and supernatural communities remained based on mutual fear and ignorance. The negotiation that followed showcased Maya's complete transformation from the vulnerable blind woman who had accidentally collided with vampire royalty to a powerful leader whose enhanced perception allowed her to see solutions that were invisible to beings who relied on conventional sight and traditional thinking patterns. Her ability to sense the emotional undercurrents beneath official positions enabled her to identify common ground between human security concerns and supernatural community needs, while her advocacy experience provided frameworks for building trust between groups that had no historical basis for cooperation or mutual understanding. Maya's success in preventing what could have become a catastrophic battle between human and supernatural forces demonstrated that her coronation as vampire queen represented more than symbolic victory. Her leadership, proving that hybrid perspectives could indeed transcend the artificial divisions that had separated their communities for centuries, while offering hope for a future where cooperation replaced conflict as the defining relationship between species sharing the same world. The negotiations between human and supernatural forces had reached their most critical juncture when Maya felt the first contractions ripple through her enhanced awareness, like seismic tremors announcing an earthquake that would reshape both their worlds. Her supernatural pregnancy choosing the moment of maximum political tension to reach its inevitable crescendo, as if the child within her sensed that this was the perfect time to make their entrance into a reality balanced on the knife's edge between cooperation and catastrophic warfare. The human military representatives sat across from supernatural leaders in the castle's great hall, where centuries of vampire diplomacy had never faced challenges quite like this. Their weapons trained on beings they barely understood, while Maya found herself serving as translator between species whose fundamental differences in perception and priority had created seemingly insurmountable barriers to peaceful coexistence. Dr. Elena Vasquez recognized the signs immediately as Maya's enhanced perception began fluctuating wildly, her supernatural abilities surging and receding in waves that corresponded to contractions strong enough to make ancient stone walls resonate with psychic energy that both human and vampire attendees could feel pressing against their consciousness, like storm winds preceding a hurricane. Elena's medical expertise combined with supernatural healers who materialized around Maya with the urgency of beings who understood that this birth would determine not just the survival of mother and child, but the future relationship between every species represented in the increasingly chaotic assembly. Maya's labor became a symbol watched by both communities as her enhanced perception allowed her to participate actively in her own medical care, guiding the healers through complications that her unique senses could detect before traditional medical instruments or supernatural awareness could identify them. Her ability to perceive energy patterns and mystical flows, making her an essential partner in managing a birth that challenged every assumption about what was possible when vampire and human biology attempted to create new life together. The supernatural stress of giving birth to a hybrid child sent waves of power through the castle that made ancient wards flicker and caused sensitive individuals in both negotiating parties to experience involuntary psychic contact with Maya's consciousness. Their shared awareness of her pain and determination creating an unexpected bond between beings who had entered the room prepared for conflict rather than cooperation. Lucian abandoned every pretense of royal composure as he knelt beside Maya with his immortal hands trembling like a frightened child's. 8 centuries of carefully maintained emotional control crumbling beneath the weight of desperate love and terror that threatened to consume him as he watched the woman who had taught him to feel again struggle to bring their impossible child safely into a world that might reject or destroy them both. Their emotional connection stabilized Maya through the most dangerous phases of labor, as their blood bond allowed her to draw upon his supernatural strength, while he experienced every contraction and surge of power that racked her human body. Their mystical partnership demonstrating the kind of unity that their child would represent if given the chance to grow and thrive in communities willing to embrace rather than fear the possibilities that cooperation could create. The birth itself defied every medical and mystical precedent as Aurora emerged into the world with eyes that blazed with starlight and skin that seemed to glow with inner radiance, her first breath drawing energy from both vampire and human observers. While her enhanced perception immediately began cataloging the emotional and supernatural signatures of every being present in ways that transcended anything either species had evolved to achieve. The daughter they welcomed possessed her mother's enhanced perception magnified beyond human limitations, and her father's supernatural strength tempered by an empathy that allowed her to understand both communities with equal clarity. But more than the simple combination of their abilities, Aurora demonstrated something entirely new in the way she perceived reality, through multiple types of awareness simultaneously. The child's birth sent psychic waves rippling through both supernatural and human communities that extended far beyond the castle walls. Her emergence into consciousness creating resonances that awakened dormant psychic abilities in humans who had never suspected such potential, while simultaneously inspiring supernatural beings with visions of evolution that challenged their assumptions about the fixed nature of their own limitations. Humans with latent psychic sensitivity found themselves experiencing flashes of enhanced perception that revealed the emotional and energy patterns Maya had learned to navigate, while vampires and other supernatural beings felt their own abilities expanding in ways that suggested their species had barely begun to explore their true potential for growth and adaptation. Maya and Lucian named their daughter Aurora to represent the dawn of a new age where the boundaries between species would become bridges rather than barriers. Her very existence proving that coexistence was not just possible, but could create opportunities for advancement that neither community could achieve through isolation and mutual suspicion. The baby's first vocalization transcended ordinary crying as Aurora released a psychic pulse that spread through the castle like ripples in a cosmic pond. Her innate understanding of both human emotions and supernatural energy, allowing her to project feelings of peace and hope that calmed the hostile forces, surrounding the negotiation table with an effectiveness that centuries of diplomacy had never achieved. The assembled human military representatives found their aggression dissolving as Aurora's influence helped them perceive supernatural beings as individuals with hopes and fears rather than monsters to be eliminated, while vampire nobles who had spent the evening plotting traditional responses to human threats discovered themselves considering possibilities for cooperation that their ancient prejudices had previously made unthinkable. 6 months after Aurora's birth, had transformed the Supernatural Summit from potential battleground into historic peace conference, Maya established the first human supernatural integration center in a renovated mansion outside Detroit, where her enhanced perception made her uniquely qualified to mediate between species whose different ways of experiencing reality had created misunderstandings that often escalated into violence before proper communication could be established. The center provided support for mixed couples navigating the challenges of interspecies relationships, guidance for supernatural beings seeking to understand human society, and education for humans learning to recognize and respect the supernatural communities that had always existed alongside them in shadows and secrecy. Maya's work drew upon everything her blindness had taught her about perceiving beyond surface appearances. Her lifetime of advocating for the invisible and forgotten, translating perfectly to helping beings whose differences had made them targets of fear and discrimination find acceptance and understanding in communities willing to embrace diversity as strength rather than threat. Lucian transformed vampire society through progressive policies that welcomed change while preserving the positive traditions that had allowed their species to survive and thrive across millennia. His evolution, from fear-based ruler to inspirational leader, encouraging other supernatural communities to examine their own resistance to growth and adaptation. Their marriage had become a symbol that inspired supernatural leaders throughout the world to consider cooperation over competition, integration over isolation, and the possibilities that emerged when ancient enemies chose trust over suspicion as the foundation for building shared futures. The vampire king, who had once ruled through terror, now governed through example, his transformation demonstrating that even the most established patterns of behavior could evolve when love provided sufficient motivation for change. Aurora grew with the supernatural speed that characterized hybrid development, but her emotional and intellectual growth proceeded at a pace that allowed her parents to guide her through discoveries that would reshape both their understanding of what was possible for beings who transcended traditional species boundaries. Her extraordinary empathy manifested as an ability to sense and respond to emotional energy from both humans and supernatural beings, her perception operating on levels that made deception impossible, while her natural compassion ensured that such insight was always used for healing rather than exploitation. Aurora responded to spoken language with the quick intelligence that both her parents possessed, but she also communicated through emotional resonance and psychic connection, her developing consciousness demonstrating ways of experiencing the world that transcended anything either vampire or human communities had previously encountered or imagined. The child's unique perspective promised to unlock solutions to conflicts that had seemed intractable. Her ability to perceive truth beneath surface appearances, making her a natural mediator who could bridge misunderstandings that kept communities apart despite their fundamental compatibility. Maya's daily routine of teaching Aurora to navigate their world incorporated lessons about moving through space by sound and touch that her own blindness had mastered. But she also guided her daughter through the complexities of perceiving emotional energy and supernatural auras in ways that would allow her to help both species understand each other more clearly. The training sessions became opportunities for Maya to reflect on how her apparent limitation had actually prepared her to raise a child whose vision would extend far beyond normal boundaries. Her lifetime of experiencing reality through enhanced non-visual senses, providing the perfect foundation for understanding Aurora's multidimensional perception. Maya realized that every challenge she had faced as a blind woman in a sighted world had equipped her with skills that would prove essential for guiding a hybrid child through a reality where difference could be either celebrated as unique strength or feared as dangerous abnormality, depending on the wisdom and courage of the communities that encountered her. The story reached its fulfillment in the garden of their integrated community, where Maya and Lucian watched Aurora play with children from various supernatural species, alongside human youngsters, all of them learning from each other in ways that created friendship and understanding across boundaries that their parents' generations had considered absolute and unbridgeable. The sight of werewolf cubs teaching human children to track by scent, while young witches shared herbalism lessons with vampire offspring who had never experienced sunlight, created a living testament to the possibilities that cooperation could unlock, when fear was replaced by curiosity and prejudice gave way to celebration of diversity. Aurora moved through the group as both participant and gentle guide, her enhanced perception allowing her to mediate disputes before they escalated, while her natural charisma drew others into games and activities that showcased each child's unique abilities as gifts to be shared, rather than differences to be hidden or overcome. Maya's journey from the vulnerable blind woman who accidentally collided with a vampire king to the powerful advocate who had become mother to a new world demonstrated that love, courage, and the willingness to see beyond surface differences possess the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire civilizations willing to embrace change over stagnation. The promise embedded in their story's beginning had been fulfilled through choices that proved perceived limitations could become sources of unprecedented strength when embraced rather than feared, creating possibilities that neither species could have achieved alone, but which their cooperation had made not just possible, but inevitable.